Hello and welcome to E333. I'm your instructor, Gregory Myers. In this particular video, we're going to work a little bit more on our user panel, both on the GUI aspect of it, but also on the ability to import a particular file from the file system to ultimately create a user object. The user panel, which wraps the user object, then is going to display the fields of that particular object. And so to begin with, what we want to do is we want to decide, first of all, does our ID need to be editable? And so one of the first things that you want to do is then take a look at the properties associated with the JText ID field. And you want to scroll down then to the enabled property, in which case we can turn that off. And effectively what that means is that that field is read only. Now, depending on the application and how you want to go about doing it, you may want to allow for the user to be able to edit the ID, but to keep consistent with our discussion, in this case, we're going to make the ID essentially read only. Now, continuing on with that, we're going to need our user driver.java for some hints. Particularly the functions that we're going to be interested in are going to be our import custom and eventually also our import XML. And essentially what we're going to do is we're going to sort of replicate the behavior that we saw in our user driver, but also in our static method that allowed for us to import a custom string. All right, so to begin with, what we want to do is in our user panel, we want to create a couple of additional functions, some private and some public. You'll note here that I have also went ahead and created a user. In this case, we want it to be private. And that user is essentially the object that is going to be wrapped and then displayed in the GUI. Now, I have not initialized it yet. We'll discuss that in just a minute. What I want to do, though, is I want to focus on the methods that are going to allow for us then to create the user and then ultimately display them. And so we're not going to cover all of these methods in this video, but we're going to get started. And the first one that we're going to be interested in is going to be the public. We're going to make this a return value Boolean, although it could technically be a void, but a public Boolean. And we want to be able to import custom. And in this case, what we want to do is we want to be able to, much like we did in the public static method of the user class, we want to be able to import a custom string. Now, the return value in this case is going to be Boolean, so might as well go ahead and set this up here. We're going to just simply have the results be a Boolean, and for right now, we're going to be optimistic and say that it is going to be true, and we are going to return true. Now, likewise, we can go ahead and create a public Boolean import XML, which we will handle then in a later discussion. In this case, it's going to be a XML string. And just like before, we want to go ahead and create a temporary results variable and return it, return results rather, not just simply return true, return results. But we want to take this one step further in that we also want the option to have an overload that we are going to also have as a return value of Boolean import custom. But this is actually going to accept a file, and we're going to call this a custom file to indicate that it is going to be one of our .user files. So this is going to accept a user file. And just like before, we're going to just go ahead and set it up to return a true. Let's go ahead and specify that we want to provide a java.io file. And then likewise, we want to have an overload here of a public Boolean import XML. And instead of a string, we want to accept java.io.file. In this case, we want to accept a XML file. And so accept a XML file. And then the last one that we want to have, last method, so that we can share some of this, is actually going to be a private method, with the private method handling the job of extracting the string out of either the custom file or the XML file. All right, so the idea here is that we can control this behavior using the public methods, but then share some of the code underneath, because effectively you would agree that the import custom and the import XML are both going to simply read a text file in, and the format is what is going to be different. So we can share some of this by simply having a private Boolean, and we're just going to call this import string. And at this point, then this is going to be a java.io.file, and this is going to just simply be the file name. Okay, so so I'm going to call this a string file, and that just simply means that it's a text file as opposed to a binary file. And then once again, we're going to have our Boolean results and our return results. Now, this approach brings us to a rather interesting discussion then, because what we would do here is we would have a lot of duplicated code between each of these functions. The idea instead would rather be that we would use then this import string function to be able to get the contents of the file, the string out of the file, then that could be ultimately used by our import custom or our import XML, but particularly then the overloads that accepted a string. Meanwhile, the public interface, in other words, the import XML that accepted the file or the import custom that accepted the file, could also be called. So the idea here is that our import custom or import XML that accepted the file could then call the import string. But in order to do that, then if you think about it, it would probably be better not that it returned a Boolean, but that it actually returned the string from the file. Now, you can proceed on this path. There would be no problems with that. The only downside to it is that it would require the addition of an additional private variable, which would effectively host the contents of the file. And so once these functions returned, then you would simply then read the contents of the file. So it's not it's not the only way to go about doing it. So what I would like to do instead of having the Boolean return values is, let's think about a more practical return value for the import XML and the import custom. So we'll start with our import string, and our import string should probably logically return a string, in which case we're just going to change our results then from a Boolean to a string. And the idea here being is that there would be temporary variable that we would initialize to an empty string in the event that nothing is returned, or the file, for instance, is not found. Now the question becomes, what does the import custom and the import XML file do when they accept a XML or a file in general? So the first step here would be that they simply call our import string method to read the contents of the file. Once they have the contents of the file, then they can call their corresponding import custom and import XML that accepts the string, parse the string appropriately, and then either return the object or return a Boolean, depending on what you ultimately want to be exposed. Now, in this particular case, we probably don't want to expose the user object itself. That's the purpose of the wrapping. And also note that we've actually made the user private. So instead, what we probably want to do is we probably want to leave our import custom with the string overload and the import XML with the string overload, both returning a Boolean value, as well as the import custom file and import XML file also simply returning a Boolean. All right, so then the first step that we would want to do here is we would essentially want our import custom and our import XML to make a call to our import string. And you can do this one of two ways. As a matter of fact, I'm going to show you both of them here. So we're going to simply say if import string, and we're going to pass to it the custom file if that returns true, else actually if it returns an empty string, then this means no string was found, or possibly no file was found. Okay. And if this is the case, then what we want to do is we want to say results equal to false. Under the else branch, so if the contents that were returned from the import string was not equal to an empty set of quotes, then what do you want to do with it? Well, then we want to actually parse the file. We want to parse the contents of the file. Well, the problem with it is we made a call to our import string method, but we didn't capture the results. Okay, so we didn't capture the contents of the file. So we've got two ways to go about doing this. We can go ahead and create a temporary variable here called contents, and we'll just simply set it equal to an empty quote. And then outside the function, we can say contents equal to import string, and we'll pass to it the custom file. And then in the if statement, once the contents are returned, we simply check to see if the contents are still equal to the empty quotes, in which case you return false. Else, you simply pass then the contents of that file onto your import custom string function. And so in this case, then we would set it up with another if statement So inside of here, it'd be else if import custom. And in this case, then we're going to pass to it the contents. And if this returns false, else, then our results would be equal to false. And if not, then the results would be equal to true, which means we need to update our GUI. Okay, so we need to update the GUI potentially. And we'll get back to this in just a second, because I'm going to show you then ultimately how I would suggest that you handle this. But notice here that because of the way I have the logic set up, where I'm checking to see if it is equal to an empty set of quotes, that basically what this means is that I'm essentially weeding out possibilities, and I could have an else if here of the import custom contents equal to false. And then basically, if I make it through each one of the else ifs, then the only way that you can get through all of the else ifs is if it successfully parsed the file. So the file existed, you could parse the file, and so on. Okay. Now, we can do the same thing down here with respect to the contents. One way that you can go about doing this is that you can set then the contents equal to the output of the import custom or the import XML. But then what you would do then is you could check it all in line, much like what we did up here earlier, where we assigned the value of the read line method to the line variable. And notice that that operation was hosted inside of these parentheses. And then we turned around and checked to see if it was not equal to null. I don't like that approach quite as much, but it is a little bit cleaner in some people's eyes. So I just want to show it to you. So effectively what you do here is you still have a string contents, but what you can do then is you can simply say if contents equal to import, in this case, we're going to do an import XML, and we pass to it the XML file. And if that is equal to an empty set of quotes, then you simply say results equal to false. All right, and let's see where we have our mismatch here. Sorry, we've got a typo here. This is supposed to be import string. And so this then just allows for you to do this all in one line. I don't necessarily encourage this. I just wanted to make sure and let you be aware that there is a second way to go about doing this in Java. But rather, what we want to do to wire this up is similar to what we did before, where we simply said contents is equal to the import string, and we accept the XML file, and then from there then we check to see if our contents are equal to an empty set of quotes. If that's the case, then results equal to false, else. Now what we want to do is we want to check to see what happens when we pass our results, when we pass our contents now to our import XML with the overload that accepts a string. So in this case, if import XML, this time with the contents, if this equals false, then we simply say results equal to false, else we would want to update our GUI, but at the very least, we'll say results are equal to true, which technically is the default value for true for results to begin with. All right, so essentially now we've got this wired up so that either our import XML with the overload of the file or the custom with the overload of the file calls then our import string. So we're going to come back to our import XML in just a little bit, but let's now focus on what our import string should be able to do. And to see what it needs to be able to do, we can actually go back now to either our user driver.java or our user.java. Either is fine. But if we want to take a look now at our import custom here, to sort of get an idea of what it needs to be able to do, we can assume that instead of a file name that's being passed, that we're getting a file itself. And by the way, if you don't like this name here, a string file, you can also, for instance, change it to a source file. That's perfectly fine. I just wanted to emphasize that the contents of the file is a string. And then what it needs to be able to do is it simply needs to be able to open an input file and read from it and put it into a contents, or in this case, results. Okay, so essentially what we're going to do is we're going to borrow these three lines here, with the exception being that we don't have to redeclare the input file. So if you want to call it source file, string file, or input file, any of the three is perfectly fine. So we'll start off. We'll go ahead and borrow this line of code from our earlier project. And once again, if you want to call this contents or results, doesn't really matter. If you want to change this string file to an input file, is also fine. Okay. Now, if we come down here, remember that we had to encapsulate all of this inside of a try catch. And specifically what we wanted to do is we wanted to catch the java.lang.exception. All right, and we're going to call this EX, and then just like before in our earlier example, if there is a problem, we simply just want to print out the exception. We're not going to triage it yet. We're hoping that we've actually going to cover all of the scenarios. In other words, we're going to check to see if the file exists. If the file doesn't exist, we're simply going to return an empty string. So ideally, we won't be throwing any unhandled exceptions. So print line and then ex dot toString. Okay, so as I said, the very first thing that we want to check to see if our input file exists. And if our input file exists, then we actually want to do something with it. Otherwise, or else is just going to simply reinforce what we've already said earlier, and that is our results are going to be equal to 0. Otherwise, what we want to do is we simply want to open the input file using our input file reader and our input buffer reader. So we want to go ahead and initialize these. So our input file reader is going to be equal to new java.io.file reader, and we want to use the input file as our seed or our argument. Likewise with our input buffered reader, new java.io.buffered reader, and we can use the input file reader as the argument there. And as always, before we forget, let's go ahead and close the file. And then inside of here, we simply want to aggregate the contents of the file. And much like what we did earlier, we just simply loop through while an individual line is not equal to null. We simply want to append that line to our contents. So we're going to need one more temporary variable here, and that is going to be a line. Once again, if you would prefer to change the results to contents, that's perfectly fine, but we do want to have a temporary variable called line, and while our line, which is equal to our input buffered reader dot read line sorry, input buffered reader selected the wrong autocomplete there. Input buffered reader dot read line, while that is not equal to null, then we simply say results plus equals our line. And then all this does is this just appends the contents line by line. Line by line. Now, the other thing that we want to do is we want to go ahead and maintain any of the new lines there. So we'll go ahead and include that when we are adding a line to the results. All right. Now, at this point then, essentially what we have is we have our import XML can pass a file to a shared import string method. The import string method will return a string either back to the import XML or to the import custom. And we're going to focus in on the import custom such that if the import custom contents equals false, in other words, we've captured the contents, all right, and if it's no longer an empty string, then we want to pass it now to our import custom. And at this point, then we want to pass that to the static method of our user class, because the static method of our user class is the method that's most tightly associated with the user, so it knows how to construct a user. And if you recall, then it just accepts that custom string and it returns a user. And what we want to do is we want to think just a little bit about what that means. So we made a choice to write the import custom method in such a way that it will construct a temp user pretty much in as many cases as possible. Okay, so the only way that you're going to wind up returning null is if the constructor or this factory method cannot successfully split enough of the information. Okay, so technically we have a temp user that could be null. As a matter of fact, we can actually go ahead and initialize it to null. But the idea here is if it passes a string and that can be split into lines, and then those lines can be split into the appropriate chunks, and enough of the information can be found, then we would return a user. Okay, and so down here then is where we have our logic there to decide which one of our constructors gets called. And then here we've got to decide then where do we set these additional fields? Well, here's the dilemma. Because we do not have a parameterless constructor, if you take a look, our temp user can effectively be null if we get to the scenario in which none of these cases are true. So in other words, we can create, down here, we create a new parameterless constructor. Excuse me, we create a new object using the parameterless constructor. And in that parameterless constructor, as a matter of fact, if we go to the source real quick, we indicate that the user is incomplete. So we can leverage this instead of throwing an exception when it is not null, or rather when it is null, my apologies there. We can either throw an exception when it is null, or what we can do is we can leverage a temp user here. So we're going to say user, temp user. And what we're going to do is we're simply going to use the EE333.user.import_custom, the static method, and we're going to pass that custom string to it. And since the way we've written it, we are guaranteed that we're going to get a user back, we can simply say that if our temp user dot status is equal to EE333.status.incomplete, then our results are going to be equal to false. Else, we need to update our GUI. All right, so basically what this is saying is that we have a valid object. Now, you could use a temporary user, at least inside this function, and then once you return, or before you return your results, then you set that temp user equal to, or assign the value of it to our user. Or what you can do here, instead of using this temporary variable like we did earlier, you can just simply say this dot user is going to be equal to that return value from the import custom. Either is fine. Either has approaches, has benefits. Either approach has benefits or some detrimental behavior. In this case, what we're leveraging is that we essentially have a gentle return, meaning that we're not going to, from our import custom, we aren't going to throw an exception, okay, or return a null object. So at least we get a user that is incomplete as opposed to no user at all. Now, under the else branch, what we want to do is we want to update the GUI with the field or the values that are associated with each of the individual properties of our object. So we're going to start off with this dot, we'll start with the first name, or actually we'll start with the ID. We can say dot set text. And in this case, what we want to do is we want to set it to whatever this dot user dot get ID. And you can see now that essentially what you're going to do is you're going to wire up the fields with the properties in the object. So in this case, it's going to be this dot j text, and I'm going to shoot for the last name now, dot set text, this dot user dot get last name, I think I accidentally skipped over the first name. No big deal. We'll just add that. Just make sure and change the appropriate field names. So in this case, it's going to be the first name. We're going to do the same then with the address. This will be get address. We're going to have the same then for the city. And then we now need to think about how we're going to handle the state and the status. For your combo boxes, it's going to be a little bit different, but the same principle. We still want to set, in this case, J combo box dot state. We want to set the selected item. If we knew the index, we could do it that way, but in this particular case, we want to set the selected item based on this dot user dot get state. And then the last one is going to be essentially very similar. We're going to set the status using the set selected item. And what we're going to do is we're going to be confident that our importer will handle only the enumerators that we have in our user class. So in this case, we wouldn't need to necessarily have a try catch here, but it's going to be this dot user dot get status. But more importantly, it's not just going to be the status, is we're actually going to need to go ahead and specify the toString method for the status enumerator, because remember, our combo box only knows about the strings, not the enums themselves. Okay, and so there are other ways of going about doing this, but this is perfectly fine. Now, this means then that our import custom is essentially set to go, assuming that it gets a valid user. Okay, so in other words, it's not an incomplete user, which then lends itself to ask the question, what do we do if we do get an incomplete user? And once again, just for emphasis here, I'm actually going to go ahead and say results equal to true, even though technically that's what we initialized it to. Now, what does it mean when our user is incomplete? Well, if you go back here to our factory method, you'll note that the order in which we've done things is we've called the parameterless constructor, but we've still went ahead and appended the address, the city, the state, the status. There's a couple of different ways that you can do this. You could either move this up here into the places where only a valid user is being created. But essentially what this is saying is that if we did not have a valid first name, valid last name, and a valid ID and or a valid ID, that we didn't wind up with a valid user, although they could have technically provided us with additional information. So you've got a couple of options in what you can do here. What I would recommend that you do is if you have an incomplete user, is just simply clear out the fields. So in this case, the ID is going to be, so we're going to set the text. We're going to just simply set it to an empty field or empty string. And you can do that then with each one of your fields here. So the first name, and once again, there can be arguments made both ways. Would you want to display a partially created object and so on? But once again, it's a little more application specific about how you want to handle this, but at the very least, you probably want to clean out what was currently in those fields. And then the last question then becomes, what do you want to display for our combo boxes? Okay, particularly the state combo box. And so when it comes to selecting the selected item, what do you pick? And so if you pick nothing, then essentially that combo box is not selected. And if you see here, if we pause this for just a second, if you run the file, you'll notice that it has to have a default value set here. So what do you set as that default value? And it's usually just simply the first index. So in other words, we select the set selected index to simply the first value. And then what you could do here for your JCombo status is I would probably suggest to set the selected item, not necessarily to the first item, but set it to the user dot get status. And the reason is we've already sort of used that status in our logic. Might as well go ahead and reinforce that so the user sees that at least the object that was returned was incomplete. And you can once again decide if you want to add the other fields that from the partially imported user or expand out on this depending on how you want to display the partially created user, or maybe even have a separate GUI that then forces the addition of those fields. Now, that handles the import custom. All right, and we're going to go ahead and build it. And we're going to go ahead and see if we've got some working code here. So I'm going to go ahead and jump out to Explorer real quick, make sure that I've got the appropriate files and the appropriate locations. And then what we're going to do is we're going to attempt to forcibly import one of our users. All right, so assuming then that you have copied your sample.user into your classes folder, rather that you have your sample.user in your main root of your directory here, then what we're going to do is we're going to come back up here and we're going to sort of force the issue in our constructor. This is just temporary. But what we're going to do is we're going to reuse our input file variable, and we're going to set it now equal to a new java.io.file. And specifically, we're going to hard code in here that sample.user that we just saw in the file system. And then what I want to do now is I want to make a call to this .import custom, and specifically I want to make a call to the import custom function that accepts the custom file. And so, and we want to pass to that then that input file. And let's see if this actually works. So ideally what will happen is I'll see this sample user now in my GUI. And so if I right click and I run the file, notice I'm running the frame. The frame is going to have a panel, and the panel is the one that actually has the code. Interestingly enough, if you take a look, our frame has no code yet. And so if we run the file, you'll see that I am in fact in Alabama. There is my information. And technically I can change my status as well as my state. Now, just to prove that I'm not doing anything tricky here and to show that I am actually using the active file and that, I'm going to change my enum to active. I'm going to save my sample.user and I'm going to rerun my user frame. And sure enough, there you go. My user frame, which has my user panel, can in fact read this file. So hopefully you found this video useful. I think this is a good stopping point. I'm going to pick up in another video then with how you would handle this by not hard coding it. So if anything, what we want to do is we want to leave off by commenting out this code. This is just a way to forcibly test it. And then what we're going to do then is we're going to build on that. We're going to show how to not only launch your GUI through the user driver, but then also be able to use the frame. In other words, there's our lovely import button. What we would like to be able to do is to simply have a file name specified here and to be able to click on import to accomplish the same thing that I have now hard coded. So once again, hopefully you found this video useful. If you have any questions or comments, don't hesitate to email me.